You're just in time. So if everyone can just...
It's already.
I mean, from Jimmy about the 27th. We were going to put together a meeting with the...
We should probably use the mic. Okay. Okay, so let's get started so we can have this great presentation. We first need to adopt the agenda for today. Do I hear? So moved. Second. All right. All in favor? Aye. All right. And adoption of the minutes from the February Borough Board meeting.
So moved.
All right. Second. Great. All in favor? Okay. Wonderful. Thank you. We are going to jump right in today to a presentation by the Department of City Planning on the flood resilience zoning text proposal. So without further ado, I'm going to turn this meeting over to James. Do you want to just set this up a little bit?
So good morning, everyone. So we have Michael Brown, Manuela Bogadeco, and then the rest of the Department of City Planning team here to present on proposed zoning text for resiliency, for flood mitigation, so on and so forth. And of course, this all grew out of Hurricane Sandy, and as we all knew, our city was unprepared, not only in infrastructure, in the built environment, and also in zoning. So a lot of what, obviously the storm had catastrophic impacts, and then as property owners tried to repair their buildings, rebuild their structures, they found that the zoning actually prevented them from planning for the future and being more resilient as time goes on to prepare for the next storm, which, as we know from global warming, things are just going to get worse and worse and worse. And so DCP has been really doing some excellent work. Of course, this will all go through full public review, where I'm sure your land use committees will look at it very carefully. But I think the one thing I wanted to stress is that most of this is making things that are already on the books that they put into place after Sandy permanent. They passed a bunch of sort of emergency zoning text that went through the full standard process, but it's making a lot of that permanent. However, they've also have some lessons learned from that. So they're proposing some tweaks to some of those aspects and some new mitigation measures as well. So just so you see, most of what is happening is just making things that were implemented post-Sandy permanent. So I just want to contextualize their efforts. And without further ado, I'll just turn it over to Michael.
Great, thank you very much. And thanks to all of you for the opportunity to chat with you this morning. So again, I'm Michael Morell. I'm the Director of Waterfront and Open Space Planning at the Department of City Planning. I also oversee our resiliency work. So as James said, today we're going to be giving you a preview of a proposal for zoning. Sorry, the cursor is jumping around on the screen. I didn't realize that happens. Was there? Thank you. Excellent. We're previewing for you a proposal called Zoning for Flood Resiliency. This is a preview, and it's actually well in advance of actually starting Bueller. So within the next couple of weeks, we're going to be releasing a document that we're calling the Plain English proposal of this planning proposal. And that plain English version is intended to be the first document that members of community boards, as well as the public as a whole, can see and understand about the proposal before we get to scoping for the environmental review, before we get to the formal Bueller process, so that, and this is perhaps a novel approach, so that the public can really understand what we are proposing before it gets into the technical jargon of zoning language. And so that document is going to be coming out in the next couple of weeks. But before we did that, I wanted to present to the borough boards. So we're going to all 5 borough boards. And as James said, much of what we are proposing is already built into zoning. And so immediately after Hurricane Sandy, we began to work on a zoning text amendment that many of you saw if you were in your offices in 2013. And that was to allow property owners, homeowners, to make the necessary repairs and improvements to their properties after Hurricane Sandy to the standards that FEMA had just released after Hurricane Sandy, the new elevations set forth by FEMA. Since that time, we've learned a lot more through the rebuilding process and through numerous private and public projects. And so we want to incorporate those elements that we learned over the past several years into the proposal as well. And we'll go into what all of that means. Oh, sorry. Yeah, there we go. Okay, so today's agenda, we're going to go, ignore the red cursor that keeps on jumping onto the screen. We'll be, oh no, I thought hiding behind my back would work. We'll be going through the introduction, the outreach process, preliminary recommendations, and then end with the timeline and the outreach resources. So let's talk about, start with the introduction. Here in Manhattan, we are obviously an island. The rest of the city as a whole lies on a total of 3 islands and a peninsula. We are a waterfront city. In the city of New York, we have 520 miles of waterfront, and with that comes an incredibly diverse risk. These areas face different flood risks and different issues with current regulatory framework, and we'll get more into that in a minute, and require particular strategies to make them resilient. But this is a citywide zoning text amendment, and so we are looking at everything from the high-density waterfront of Lower Manhattan, the mixed-use waterfront in Williamsburg, as well as Rockaway in the low-density development in Rockaways in Queens, Queens. But this is all to say that we have approaches for all of this. Let's start with the flood risk in Manhattan. Manhattan has approximately 2,700 lots within the floodplain. The FEMA defined 1% annual chance storm flood risk. There's also approximately an additional 2,000 units in the 0.2%, or what's frequently referred to as the 500-year floodplain. That's a larger storm event as FEMA would predict it. But the total number of buildings, and this is what's interesting, is that though we have about 2,700 lots in the floodplain in Manhattan, there are approximately 3,500 buildings in the floodplain, which is to say that there are many areas of Manhattan that have multiple buildings on a single lot, a campus-style development here in Manhattan. Obviously no surprise to the folks in this room.
I'm sorry, what are the abbreviations? Firm plus...
Oh yes, excuse me, yes. So the firm is the flood insurance rate map. That's put forth by FEMA. The P firm is the preliminary flood insurance rate map, and this requires a little bit of history. So the National Flood Insurance Program in Manhattan in New York City, was first adopted starting in 1983. Between 1983 and Hurricane Sandy, there were only minor updates to the flood maps. Right after Hurricane Sandy, FEMA released the preliminary flood insurance rate maps, which were intended to be a more precautionary standard, doing some of the preliminary remapping of the flood risk for the city. Those had some technical errors, and so the city appealed those, and so we're still in the process of adopting new flood maps. But for the time being, the city is, for the purpose of building code, is using both the total geographies combined of the firm and the P firm. And so that's what the numbers are looking at here. In Manhattan, I should say that in general, the P firm is larger than the firm. But that's not the case everywhere, which is why we have to use both geographies. So just looking very quickly across Manhattan's floodplain and the types of buildings that we have the classic 5-story tenement with retail or a bodega on the ground floor, small former row houses that are likely now apartments on 22nd Street, newer apartment buildings on Avenue C, as well as campus-style buildings along the FDR, the NYCHA campus on the right. All of this work is embedded within the city's overall resiliency strategy of One NYC, that looking at coastal defenses, infrastructure, and making certain that residents and businesses are prepared. All of this work is still, of course, ongoing. This work that we're talking about today really fits into the category of building, making certain that buildings are designed to withstand and recover from flooding. So, the question is oftentimes, how does this all relate now to flood insurance and to FEMA's standards? So it's a bit of a complicated picture because the FEMA establishes the flood insurance rate maps, and those are used for two separate purposes. One is the National Flood Insurance Program, which requires that if you have a mortgage and that mortgage is backed by the federal government, that you are required to purchase flood insurance, and that you're located within the flood zone, you're required to purchase insurance. Yes, ma'am.
What is the difference between rentals and condos on one hand and co-ops on the other?
In terms of how the flood insurance program works, that is correct. Yes, we could go into more of that in a little bit if you want.
I don't know if
Okay.
that affects any of the.
It doesn't affect how buildings ultimately get designed, because separate from the insurance requirements, FEMA also puts forth construction standards. And the construction standards get incorporated into the state building code and into the local building codes, and that is really the driver for the regulations. So the insurance, there are two separate pieces that are obviously closely related, rely on the same geographies by and large, which is what FEMA defines as the flood zone. But then there's the insurance, the mandatory insurance purchase, and the construction standards. And for the purposes of zoning and building code, it's the construction standards that are most relevant. And so the construction standards are set forth in what's referred to as Appendix G of the building code. It's a separate appendix of the very large document of the building code. And we want to make certain that zoning can accommodate the necessary standards and the regulations. So that's to say that if a building is required to be elevated up because of the FEMA standards that are then set forth in the building code, we want to make certain that zoning allows for that. And we'll get into more detail on that in a second. So we have done we've been quite busy since Hurricane Sandy. In 2013, we passed Flood Text 1, which were the temporary provisions that I mentioned earlier. These were intended to remove zoning barriers to allow storm damaged buildings and new buildings to comply with the higher flood standards set forth by FEMA. It's going to expire 1 year after the adoption of the new FEMA flood maps. We anticipate that occurring in 2022, so another few years out. Oh, is that? No, okay. We expect that those maps to be adopted in 2022, but we want to make certain that we have the zoning in place well in advance of that. We don't want to come into a scenario where we adopt the new maps and then building owners are not able to take advantage of zoning that accommodates those standards. In addition, we also passed special regulations for neighborhood recovery. These were primarily for lower density districts outside of Manhattan, but there were special regulations that were passed after Hurricane Sandy particularly to assist the Build It Back program in making the necessary repairs, replacements, and improvements. But both of those text amendments, and this is quite important, both of those text amendments were intended to facilitate Sandy recovery, and that they were very much focused on what happened during Hurricane Sandy and how can we make the necessary improvements after Hurricane Sandy. What we are looking to do now, though, is also look into the future, further into the future, and not just about recovery, but also looking toward resiliency. And as James mentioned at the start of this, looking at what is to come. And with sea level rise, with changing climate that we all know, the New York City Panel on Climate Change just last week set forth their new projections, which is saying that the sea level around New York will rise, and we have to be prepared for that. And that's really where we're taking the zoning text amendment. There has been some construction and some retrofits for floodproofing here in Manhattan. A retrofitting of 32 Old Slip in Manhattan. These posts were installed to be able to fit floodgates or flood panels, which are these large silver panels that slide into these posts in advance of a storm, preventing floodwaters from entering the building. That's one example. These metal shutters that look somewhat similar to a security gate, those are actually floodproofing. It's a floodproofing strategy as well. Two examples of retrofit. A couple of other buildings, a couple of other projects to note. This is elevated building at 120 Wall Street. You can see this is an elevated retail space where you have to walk up about 5 steps to get into the retail because of the flood levels. And generators being placed atop the garage rooftop in the East Village, another resiliency strategy.
Question.
Yes.
What about the subway systems?
Yes. So there's quite a bit being done regarding the subways to make them to flood-proof them. Zoning does not directly address that, so I won't be talking about that there. But if you want to talk more about that afterwards, we can certainly chat, and I can put you in touch with folks. Yes.
On the example with the retail or the elevated building.
Yes.
How does that reconcile with NGA?
Yes, very good question. So most frequently there has to be another means of access into the space. I don't know the example of this particular building, but almost always their ADA requirements still matter. It's quite common now to see the stair lifts on buildings to be able to accommodate that. So let's talk a little bit about our outreach process. So we've done, since Hurricane Sandy, as I mentioned, we've been quite busy. Between 2014 and 2017, we've prepared 10 separate neighborhood studies, including 2 here in Manhattan, in Chelsea, West Chelsea, as well as Lower East Side, East Village, Two Bridges area. We also did 4 topic-specific studies, a report on retrofitting existing buildings to address flood risk, a book and a compendium piece to the West Chelsea study on resilient art spaces. We looked at resilient retail, actually to the photo we just saw, as well as resilient industry. These are all of this has been helpful in forming how we're going to be addressing these risks going forward. Since 2016, we've also been doing a significant amount of outreach on the citywide issues, and that culminated last year, about 6 months ago, with an outreach summary document, a summary of all of the issues that we heard from the public, and that's now available on our website. So we've, and here's a long list of the number of meetings that we've had, but all of this is going to really be distilled and encapsulated into the zoning for flood resiliency proposal that we're coming out with in just a couple of weeks. From the members of the communities throughout the city, we've heard a number of different issues, really 6 different issues. The first is about flexibility with height. Because we're going to be elevating buildings up, new buildings up, or retrofitting buildings, wanting to make certain that there's flexibility with that zoning envelope. The next 2 issues pertain primarily to lower density districts, not found in Manhattan. It's about a smaller, a squatter envelope for detached homes, as well as allowing homes in industrial areas to recover. Number 4 is the need for better design controls, recognizing that as we're elevating buildings up, that there becomes an issue with what's happening at the street level, and wanting to make certain that we don't kill our street life, an important part of New York City's life. One of the reasons I think many of us like living in New York. Number 5 is keeping active uses at the sidewalk level. I showed this photo earlier of the elevated retail space, wanting to make certain that at 5 steps or so, you can still maintain that visual connection into a retail space. Much above that though, you really start to lose that visual connection to the retail space, and that becomes much more of an issue when to have that pedestrian experience of retail space. And then number 6 is more options for businesses to retrofit. Retrofitting buildings is difficult. Retrofitting retail space is even more difficult. The form of existing buildings that have retail at the base often is a major challenge, and so we have some strategies to to help deal with that. But let me turn it over to Manuela now, who will go into further details about the proposal itself.
Thank you all. So now I'm going to go over the recommendations, and starting with, I guess, the big question, when we think about zoning, the first thing that we think is about land use. All right. Sure. I'll speak louder. So the first thing we think about is land use, right? This is a citywide, it's going to be a citywide text amendment, like Michael mentioned, and we're touching base on different neighborhood types across the city's floodplain. So therefore, we are not changing land use patterns with this proposal. I just want to clarify that. The idea is really to amend zoning that supports the planned densities across the city's floodplain and facilitate resilient construction. There are some instances in which it may be good to limit density in order to decrease the amount of new populations coming in areas of extreme risk, such as areas that could be facing daily tidal flooding in the future with the sea level rise projections that NPCC just released. And in other areas, it may be good to encourage density in order to get more resilient building stock. And that's some areas of the city that are being rezoned, and we're going to see new development that's coming in that's going to be resilient, which is a good thing. But all of those things are really done in the local level and need a very specific and thorough analysis, and therefore this proposal is not touching on those, but really just trying to support density across the floodplain that Michael showed. So in that area, in that geography that we saw, in which we have almost 5,000 buildings in Manhattan that are in either the 1% or the 0.2% interchance floodplains, the idea for that geography is really to, first of all, allow the city to think long-term and be prepared in the 2050s and the 2080s once we start seeing sea levels rising. And that comes in two main strategies. One of them is think about geographically what is the expansion of the floodplain, as well as in terms of height in which we are placing our residential units, especially in to levels in which we are flood-proofing buildings. So you can see here the four main goals. First one, as I said, encourage resiliency throughout the city's current and future floodplains. Secondly, support long-term resiliency for all different building types that we see in the city's floodplain. And then the third goal here is one that is so particular to New York City. We have more than 90% of our lots across the city that is already built. That means that we have all this existing building stock, much of which is extremely vulnerable. And therefore, these buildings, they need extra flexibility in the zoning so they can retrofit, so they can elevate their mechanical equipment in parking spaces and things like that. And then last, we learned so much throughout the rebuilding process, and we had to conduct a second text amendment, as Michael mentioned, in 2015 with the special regulations for neighborhood recovery. And we need to make those regulations permanent in the books for, in the event we have a future storm, those particular provisions can be unlocked. Basically, you can break the glass and let those provisions be applicable in order to advance future recovery processes faster. So that's the fourth goal. And so moving forward in the presentation, I'm going to be providing an overview of the recommendations that fall within these different four buckets. So starting with applicability. So first of all, as Michael mentioned, we have this set of rules that are temporary. They're going to expire either 2020 or sometime 2022 for FloodText 1. Those regulations, they today apply to buildings that are within the 1% interchance floodplain. So this is really what building code mostly requires. And zoning was just trying to be, very direct and just allow building code and zoning to be to work together. But moving forward, when we're making these temporary rules permanent, it's important to apply the rules for lots that are within the 1% annual chance floodplain. So for instance, if we have a large campus that has several buildings on it, one, it would be smart to design, if it's a new campus, or retrofit an existing campus in the same way for all buildings. Elevate all mechanical equipment for all the buildings in order for us to really protect the city in the long term. So this is one change in the applicability that we really heard so much through the recovery process with HPD, working with NYCHA and other sister agencies. And then the other point is in regards the 1% annual chance floodplain. That geography is really just talking about current risk. And not even that, because even Hurricane Sandy flooded almost 50% of the lots in the 500-year floodplain, the 0.2% annual chance floodplain. Therefore, it's key that we expand these provisions to lots that are also within the 0.2% floodplain, so we can start thinking long-term and making buildings resilient beyond the 100-year. So moving to the second goal in regards supporting plant densities and making sure that buildings can either retrofit or be constructed resiliently. The first thing that is very key to floodplain regulations when we're thinking about zoning framework is in regards to buildings' height. In zoning we regulate the use of buildings, but also bulk, shape, and size of buildings. And in Manhattan, we have so many different districts that have different height regulations. Some of them, high factor, for instance, which are the big towers and skyscrapers, they don't really face issues with height, so those buildings can be retrofitted on the ground floor, they can do the work. But then in other instances, in low-density communities and in other types of districts, buildings today haven't been able to retrofit. They haven't been able to elevate units above the flood elevation because they're bumping into height issues. And the other thing is buildings that are being retrofitted, they have been only meeting the minimum standards by building code, so what we call the design flood elevation. And moving forward with sea level rise, we're going to see at least 3 feet of water in addition to that by the 2050s. So it's important that buildings go slightly higher, that they place the units just 3 feet extra or more in order for our buildings to be resilient in the 2050s and the 2080s, which the projections always also reach to. And the other element of this is in regards to flood insurance. Buildings that over elevate or do this extra step to elevate units, they actually reduce the flood insurance to the minimum possible. So as an example, a little single family house could pay $9,000 a year for flood insurance if they have a basement or a space below grade or units below the flood elevation. If they elevate 4 feet above the design flood elevation, which is required in building code, $9,000 goes all the way down to $400. So this is really key for the city moving forward and for homeowners and building owners in the city's floodplain. Therefore, we are making permanent an existing height flexibility that allows you either to measure from the design flood elevation, the zoning envelope, or 9, 10, or 12 feet above grade, depending on the building category, and that's a very complicated framework, so we're trying to make it easier and allow across the board any building to choose the level of protection they want to protect themselves from. So it can go anywhere from the minimum, the design flood elevation, up to 10 feet of elevation for the units. If you are in the 100-year floodplain, in the 1% annual chance floodplain, or up to 5 feet if you're in the 0.2% annual chance floodplain. So if you think about the 3 feet that I was talking about, that would assist the city's floodplain enlarged to protect themselves from long-term flooding. This is a recommendation that's really key for low-density communities. I just want to show the provisions so you are familiar with the entirety of the proposal. But in various instances across the city's floodplain in low-density communities, we have a concentration of very small lots and homeowners that have those lots since prior zoning was put in place, and they need slightly more flexibility on yards in order for them to elevate their houses or construct if in the case they get damaged in the future. So we came up with this different envelope that's going to be made permanent across the board for all communities in the floodplain so they can do the work and make their buildings safer. So it's the difference of the house that could be very tall on the left, which is what underlying zoning currently allows, and it's not really into context, to the house on the right that's more into context and also meet better the footprints of these buildings. So this recommendation here, while I'm showing a little house, because we have a lot of them across the city's floodplain, in Manhattan we also have instances in which we have non-conforming residences in manufacturing or heavy commercial districts. And currently, even with the flood text 1 and SRNR, these buildings, if they get damaged in a future storm, they have no means of being reconstructed. In the zoning, we have a 2-year rule. You can be grandfathered if you build within 2 years. But from what we experienced after Sandy, it may take much more time than that. So we just want to make sure that these buildings, if they get knocked out, they can be replaced and replaced more resiliently. Or today, if they want to undertake an improvement, they can retrofit these buildings to incorporate flood-proofing techniques. So that's one part of the proposal. And this is more of a new item that we are incorporating. So the next slide is talking about buildings design. So Michael was mentioning about the retail report that we produced and released in 2017. We did study all different commercial corridors across the city and in Manhattan. And as you saw in one of those pictures of a commercial use that was elevated in Seaport District, we've seen that as a pattern across the city's floodplain. Most new construction or even existing buildings, they would do the cheaper option for commercial uses, which is just elevate. They use to the design for elevation, which is the minimum requirement. And in order for us to not start seeing so much important active uses being elevated across the city's commercial corridors, the existing regulations provided a lot of floor area exemptions for commercial corridors to be incentivized to be kept at grade and then dry flow proofed, which is a technique that's more costly than just elevating. But today we actually give an entire ground floor for free from a floor area perspective in the existing zoning. We heard that that is too much for the floodplain, but in the same time, the communities across the city still think it's important for us to incentivize retail to be at grade and close to the pedestrian. So what we are doing, we came up with a middle ground approach in which we would offer a minor floor area allowance if you dry flow proof your active use. And then the first 30 feet from the street wall, showing in the right diagram here, could be exempted from floor area calculations. And that will come with design requirements. Transparency has to start from grade, which is something very important for Manhattan. West Chelsea report showed us that. And the other element will be that the building has to be dry flow proofed, as I mentioned. So this glass has to be able to withstand floodwaters in the event of a storm. So that's a very important element of the proposal. And then still talking about mixed-use buildings and commercial buildings across the city's floodplain, the other recommendation that came from the retail report and from the workshops that we had in especially one here in Manhattan, I think it was beginning of last year, there are a lot of instances in which businesses highly depend on subgrade spaces for their operations. And you can see that, those cellar doors across the city in Manhattan as well as the outer boroughs. Today, it's the businesses, they have the option of dry flow proofing the subgrade space, which is shown here in these diagrams. However, that's extremely expensive because you have to thicken the walls, you have to make all these structural improvements. And we haven't been seeing that measure. So that means that if we have a flood event, water will get through the building, fill up the subgrade space, and probably damage very badly the structure of the building, especially because we have so many old buildings.
In terms of subgrade space, are you talking about vaults that are under the street level as well?
Exactly, yeah, those vaults. Cellar spaces or basements if they're slightly higher. So these buildings, mixed-use construction, they are restricted from having a second floor commercial space today in several zoning districts across the city. So the kind of middle density districts. And one of the things that businesses mentioned to us is that if we allow them to have space on the top, on the second floor, like in other districts across the city, they could potentially relocate these uses to the second floor. Also, I think this will actually assist a lot of new construction to design commercial establishments in the city's floodplain, since subgrade can be even unfeasible in areas that have high water tables, for instance. So this will be another new item that we will be incorporating in the proposal. Still talking about design of buildings, the communities out there, they are really knowledgeable about resilient construction. They've been seeing resilient construction across the city's floodplain, and one of the things that we realized is that while we do have today streetscape regulations for resilient construction in the floodplain, they're not doing much. They are mostly making sure low-density communities mitigate the potential blank walls for when you elevate uses. So we want to first make sure that we have streetscape regulations across all building types in the city, including high-density areas. And secondly, that we have streetscape regulations that help with the height increase. So here you can see on the left a building that can be built today under the existing zoning. You can see the ground floor not being used for units. It's a multifamily building. And then you can see that the base height goes slightly higher than adjacent context. So for the proposed framework from a streetscape perspective, we will be incentivizing the development to actually match the base height to adjacent context. If they keep it lower, then they get a point from our streetscape regulations. And of course, the development will still be able to build under the floor area regulations, but then after that setback portion. So that's one of the things that we are exploring in the proposed action. Yes?
I see that you grayed out the parking. A lot of buildings do
The
have parking.
Yes, I can talk about that.
And some of it is subgrade, as you well know.
Yes.
And also, what are you doing about street parking in terms of where the cars go if you're trying to be resilient about that?
That's a very good question. So I took out parking because I didn't think it would be that important for Manhattan, but you're right, we should talk about it. So there are districts that still regulate them. So this is more for low-density communities, the existing regulations that we'll be making permanent, but I can talk about those points that you made. So with us facilitating buildings to elevate the units to the second floor, that means that the ground floor of residential construction can be wet flow proofed, so allow the water to come in and out of the structure. And that means that you can use only for parking, storage, or building access. So in those instances, we changed in the Flood Text 1 the regulations to facilitate parking to be put under the building instead of on the back for low-density houses. or in the front yards or at the street. So if we allow the curb cut to be more flexible, so you can put the curb cut in front of your building, and then we will be requiring at least 2 parking spots under the building because you may lose one at the street level when you create the curb cut.
But to be clear, the
But
curb
this
cut
is
rules are for
just low density.
very low density.
R1 to R5, yeah.
So not Manhattan.
Not Manhattan, yeah. But then in Manhattan, I guess we don't really have a parking provision yet, modification. But I wanted to respond to your question.
Okay.
So the next recommendation here is also a new item, and it's something that came from the Resilient Industry report that we released last year. So the report, if you read the report, it's really trying to expand on operations improvements. But there's one element that was a zoning impediment that we are trying to incorporate in the citywide proposal, which is to allow existing industrial and heavy commercial uses to create a small mezzanine within the building or a small second story, so they can elevate important equipment and important spaces. For instance, an office space, which is crucial if you have a flood event, if at least your office, your computers are safe, then you can come back to operations more quickly. And also if you have important equipment, generators or important equipment from the industry itself, you will be able to put that above harm's way. So that's another new item for industrial sites. And then now I will be talking about some of our recommendations that are tied to our rule number 3, which was to facilitate existing buildings to retrofit and be more resilient. So we call them the partial resiliency strategies. And the first thing that's really key for resiliency is to make sure that the building systems are safe. So that means you need to elevate mechanical, electrical, plumbing equipment above the design flood elevation at least, or hopefully higher, so buildings are safe in the 2050s and 2080s. So here you can see the diagram on the left showing something that we do today, which is allow more flexibility in the zoning framework for you to place mechanical equipment on top of buildings' roofs, on bulkheads. And you see mechanical equipment in large across the city being today within cellars, which it's extremely, extremely vulnerable. So that's something we would be making permanent. But then in addition to that, as part of the recovery process since Hurricane Sandy with campus housing, we've seen NYCHA HPD trying to construct mechanical buildings within campuses in order to house all the mechanical equipment for several buildings within the structures that are elevated, that make this equipment being placed above the flood elevation. So there are today several instances in which zoning is impeding that strategy, and that has been delaying a lot of the process for the sister agencies to undertake the work. So one of them is in regards minimal distance between buildings. We still have MDL regulations, the multiple dwelling law regulations, that we can't really change, but we can still be more flexible with the rule to allow these mechanical buildings to be put in campus housing. This is again for existing buildings. And then here on the corner of the slide, you can see some of the elements we're making permanent, which are facilitating, very important in Manhattan, flood panels to be put as permitted obstruction on yards and open space. And then also for more low density communities, build small retaining walls and raise the yard in front of the buildings. And for large campuses, we will be also allowing them to deploy landscape berms so they can also protect the area from flooding. So those partial resiliency strategies, they are really key to facilitate existing buildings to adapt over time, and that's something we are trying to facilitate.
Quick question.
Sure.
So, as you know, kind of as other utilities have subsurface plants. So how are you dealing with that in terms of advice to them? for resiliency as well?
So another great question. So the city has worked closely with Con Ed and other infrastructure providers. We have the Climate Adaptation Task Force amongst all of the utility owners and providers, and have worked with them to develop strategies. So Con Ed, we've also worked with Con Ed on their rate case a couple of years ago to provide them with the necessary funding specifically to make the resiliency investments. And again, we could talk more about that if you would like, but it's not directly relevant to the zoning because the underground utilities are not subject to zoning.
Okay.
It seemed like, like say for example, the wastewater treatment plant, we have that in Ward 9. I know DEP was saying they were making slight changes to, they were supposed to be making slight changes to facilitate or preemptive any increase, floodplain levels and such. Is there discussion that's ongoing on right now with that to ensure that it is meeting some of these requirements?
Very much so. So DEP has their own program for making the improvements to the wastewater treatment plants to become more resilient. Each wastewater treatment plant is its own design, and so the specifics are very tailored to each of their facilities. But if you want to know more about that, I can certainly put you in touch with our colleagues at DEP. But I wouldn't be able to speak to all the details.
Thank you. Yeah. So now the last slide about the recommendation section is in regards future recovery processes. So as I mentioned before, when Sandy happened, we had to issue the Floodtext 1 regulations in which we facilitated especially existing buildings to be reconstructed. So even those that are not complying or conforming with our bulk or use regulations in the zoning. Those, however, were not enough. In 2015, we had to conduct another emergency tax amendment and add more flexibility into the zoning for reconstruction to be facilitated and expedited. So those are more in relationship to documentation with the buildings department. So existing homeowners, a lot of them lost documentation or couldn't provide the documentation that was necessary to demonstrate that the building was built prior zoning was put in place. So this tax amendment allowed them to basically use utility bills and things like that to demonstrate how many units they had in place and what were the uses of that building. So then they could be replaced and replaced meeting Appendix G of building code, which are the flood-resistant construction standards. So those provisions, including the ones that facilitate buildings that are substantially damaged to be reconstructed, and the documentation process, we would put them in the ZR, in the zoning resolution, but they would not be available all the time on the as-of-right path, but only in the event we have a future disaster, and the state declares the emergency order, then the city will be able to very quickly allow those provisions to kick in and start functioning and then facilitating recovery. So with that, this was the last slide. And here I just wanted to share our timeline. We already spoke about where we are right now. As Michael mentioned, we will be entering the public review process sometime end of this year. Meanwhile, we are working on putting all this information within a document that's very easily accessible from communities, for communities and other elected officials across the city. And we'll be releasing that in the next couple of weeks. And then targeting the scoping to kick off the environmental review process sometime in spring this year. And here are some resources that we have in case you want to start distributing this information to your communities. You can find all this information on our website, including a map in which you can see in your community how much of the area will be impacted by sea level rise and things like that I mentioned today in the presentation.
I didn't see any mention, I'm not sure if like for hospitals, if they fall under commercial, but are there any special allocations being made for those?
For hospitals?
Yeah, so because I know during Hurricane Sandy, even not just in just hospitals, but long-term care facilities, healthcare delivery places?
That's a very good question.
So hospitals do have special requirements in the building code about having extra elevation for new construction of hospitals. Obviously, we're not seeing a whole lot of new construction of hospitals. But what we have seen for the retrofit of hospitals, and this is particularly been the case around NYU Langone in CB6, they have built flood walls around their structure, and are using deployables, deployable structures that they would put up in advance of the notice of a storm. Actually, can you? Yeah. So it's actually akin to these two solutions for the most part. So we want to make certain that there's the necessary allowances within zoning for other hospitals, other large structures like hospitals, to be able to take advantage of that as well.
And I remember that we were just re-editing the presentation to make it more legible, and we forgot to add emergency generators, which is a very key element of the proposal that touches base on hospitals especially. So today, in our permitted obstruction rules, we have really strict types of things that you can put on open space. What zoning determines that the area that has to be designated as open space on a property lot. So for those, we will be making permanent a regulation that was put in place in 2015, so the second text amendment, that allowed emergency generators and power systems to be considered permitted obstruction on yards, like rear yards and side yards, or open space areas, especially for campus housing, also in hospitals that may be in those type of districts.
So one aspect of resiliency is cleanup. How are you dealing with that? Because it can be defeating the same purpose that you want. So
Clean up after the storm?
yes.
So
Or
that's
recovery.
I'm sorry?
Or recovery.
Right. So the cleanup in particular is the domain of the Office of Emergency Management, working with sanitation and frequently a whole host of other agencies. That is not specific to the zoning. But again, if we want to talk more about how that happens, I can put you in touch with our colleagues at OEM.
Well, I worry about the barriers you're putting up on buildings, and then what you do to take them down during
Yes.
that period of recovery, and
That's
where do they go? So there is logistics involved.
That's right. So the flood panels are typically deployed when the mayor gives the emergency orders about the need for evacuation of the flood zone. That's typically the trigger point.
72 hours.
Yeah, roughly 72 hours in advance of a storm. And it's to the advantage of the building owners to take those down as quickly as, as soon as the waters recede. New York City, and I should mention this, New York City, we have the benefit, for the most part, of having topography working in our favor. That unlike New Orleans, where significant portions of the city are below sea level, in New York we don't have that problem. That topography works in our favor, so that when the floods recede, the waters drain out as well. That very much is to our benefit, obviously, so that we don't have standing water after an event. For the most part, there are a few areas where that's not the case, but for the most part, that is the case. And so that means that the flood panels can be removed and taken down very, very shortly after the storm. And that they are typically designed so that they are just at the building, just protecting the building or the campus. So it wouldn't necessarily, it doesn't close streets when we're talking about this type of thing, so it doesn't hinder the ability to clean up. Yes, ma'am.
This might be a little crazy, but I did a lot of mediation for people affected by Storm Sandy, the insurance companies, and know that wind was a major contributor to flooding and damage. So a lot of the super tall buildings create their own wind tunnels, and I wonder if there's any interaction between the wind that's artificially created by these buildings and the huge gusts of wind that might come as a result of a major storm.
I don't think that we know enough about that, but it's something that we'll discuss with DOB, since DOB's codes are the ones that regulate wind requirements. It's less of a zoning issue.
Right, but unless it is affected by those.
Yeah, unless it is, yeah, you're good. We'll have to discuss with DOB, I'm just not familiar with that.
Do any of the regulations or the strategies look specifically at NYCHA estates and NYCHA buildings? Because I don't see a presentation online from my previous district, but
So it does. The projections are not taking into account future growth. It's just looking at the geographic expansion. So it's not looking at infill, or for that matter, for the gain or loss of units anywhere else. In terms of the strategies that NYCHA can use, they're very much embedded throughout the presentation. But we could actually go back to that one. Yeah, this one. So here's an example of some of the strategies that NYCHA could use. And I would say that campus-style buildings, like NYCHA, Mitchell-Lama developments, or others that are multiple buildings on larger lots, they have the ability to take advantage of a couple of different strategies that we currently allow and will be allowing in the future. One of which, as Manuel was just discussing, was the relocation of mechanical equipment out of the cellars or the basements and into either the rooftops or the mechanical buildings, separate mechanical buildings, or using the yard space around the buildings to raise the yards, build berms or walls, as well as deploying flood panels that can be used to protect the campus.
So that's why I have a question about NYCHA, because they're looking at the NYCHA state and the open space as a place where you can
Oh,
so then you
I see.
have a policy
Yes.
that influence
Yeah,
that
so we've been working closely with NYCHA and with their resiliency team on these proposals. It's not something that has been that they have raised as an issue, but we'll ask that exact question. It's a good one.
Anyone else? Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Oh,
Oh yes, thank you for mentioning that. So we'll be releasing the plain language version in just a couple of weeks. We'll be sending that to all community boards, and upon request, we can certainly make arrangements to discuss this further.
And that's available, this is available all around.
It will be available. The document itself will be available in a couple of weeks. So this is a sneak preview.
It's not on the website.
It's not on the website now. This is a sneak preview just for our close friends. Yes. Yes. Yeah, I've heard. Great. Thank you all.
Thank you. Okay, moving on to the Borough President's report. Tonight, the Borough President is having a forum on congestion pricing. It will start at 6 p.m. at Cooper Union. Hoping to see many of you there. Last night, and here's a flyer. Thank you, Richard. And we have many of those. If you want to take some with you before you leave, certainly can give you hard copies of this. Last night, the Borough President had her Women's History event. It focused on the growing number of the population of women in prison. And with that also, this office wanted people to know that there is a proposed project in Chelsea that would convert a former prison into a facility for economic development for women, and the Borough President's office is supportive of that development. Mechanical voids. This office submitted testimony that was due on March 7th. This office and the Borough President worked very hard and was very pleased with the 200 Amsterdam decision from the judge regarding the gerrymandering of zoning lots. And while pleased with some aspects of this mechanical void text amendment, not all, and looking forward to the second cycle, or second phase of mechanical voids, and having input on that. This little thing that we do every year called CB appointments, community board appointments. So we received 649 applications. 414 were new applicants, 235 were re-applicants, and we currently have 75 vacancies across the 12 boards, and approximately 10 of those are midterm appointments. So people who resigned in between and their term is up next year. So there will be several one-year appointments, and the bulk of them will be the 2-year appointments. We completed and concluded the group interviews Monday night. Much fun was had by all. And Aldrin was super stellar in his role of getting everyone in the different rooms and giving all the facts and scaring the bejesus out of people. Tomorrow is the deadline, and the borough president will be submitting her decisions for capital budget allocations throughout the borough of Manhattan. Regarding NYCHA, because there was a question in the back regarding the flood tax amendment in NYCHA, just wanted everyone here to know that the borough president wrote a letter to NYCHA asking that 501c3s, not-for-profits, and that CDCs, community development corporations, be considered for the RAD conversions. And now we want to have our esteemed general counsel, who's also the commissioner to the Charter Revision Commission, come up to talk about the Charter Revision and Commission and how that's going. Jim Karras.
Very briefly, we are finishing up our expert panels. Tonight is land use. Unfortunately, I know it conflicts with the congestion pricing hearing, but the topics tonight are comprehensive planning and ULURP. If you can't attend or send someone from your land use committee to attend, it's not a hearing, they're going to be experts talking about this. But there's a lot of interaction between the commissioners and the experts. At least there has been in our other panel discussions, and you can sort of see which commissioners are heading in which directions and the kinds of questions they're asking and the kinds of answers they're getting or not getting. At least from that point of view, I have found it very enlightening. So if you could send someone, that would be great. Otherwise, our website, you can watch them on the website, www.charter2019.nyc. And there's a link to videos, and it's got every meeting and hearing on YouTube. www.charter2019.nyc. So April, in part because our schedule has been contracted even further, we're a little bit scrambling because the first couple months, the Mayor's Commission was having their final round of borough hearings, and we didn't want to start having our borough hearings because we were worried that people wouldn't know which commission was which, and they'd come to our commission and start testifying on mayoral proposals that we weren't even considering. So we didn't have our borough hearings over the summer, and now we've lost a month on the back end with the early voting legislation. Our ballot questions have to be submitted a month earlier. So at this point, we've lost 3 months of our year and a half. So we're scrambling a bit. We were hoping to have additional hearings before a preliminary set of recommendations came out. We're not going to be able to do that. However, the chair recognizes that a lot of the Manhattan community boards have been working on this. So there's going to be a meeting with the chair of the commission, the senior staff to the commission, and any representatives from Manhattan community boards who want to attend on April 3rd at 6 p.m. at 250 Broadway, 26th floor. And those of you, I strongly encourage those of you who have had hearings on this or meetings on this, who have come out with resolutions on this, to send someone. You'll have an opportunity to talk about what's important to you, and you'll have an opportunity to do it before even a preliminary set of recommendations comes out. So hopefully what you say will be able to be factored into whatever those preliminary recommendations are. Now, if you don't have input at that point, that doesn't mean you don't have input. The preliminary recommendations will be just that. They'll be preliminary. And then immediately following the issuance of that will probably come out in I would say second, third week of April. And then starting the end of April, April 30th, May 2nd, May 7th, May 9th, and May 14th. I sent all the CB chairs and district managers this in writing last night. There will be another set of borough hearings. I'm not sure which, I don't want to get too specific because the last time I sent you out an update and I got a bit specific, and then because of these changes, everything changed. So check our website to see which one will be the Manhattan hearing. Doesn't mean you have to come to the Manhattan hearing. If the Queens hearing is more convenient for whoever at your board is going to be the point person on this, come to the Queens hearing. But we'd love you all to come to the Manhattan hearing, of course, and have it be by far the biggest hearing like it was the first round. That's really the update I have. I'm always available to talk to you, to answer questions. If you're interested, like I said, land use will be tonight, and there will be a portion on land use on Monday the 25th. There have also been some other really interesting expert panels. Monday night, we had the law department. Alita, you may be interested in that. I'll tell you what time to look at. There were some very interesting back and forths.
Jim, make them over the coals.
On who, in cases like Holmes, who does the law department represent? What happens to a borough president who has an argument that her powers are being stepped on when she doesn't have money for outside counsel? So those questions were raised by somebody, I can't remember who. Also, very interesting expert panel. I thought it was amazing on the Civilian Complaint Review Board and police accountability. We had experts from the CCRB in Colorado, the head of the CCRB in Cambridge, Massachusetts, who's also the head of the National League of Police Oversight Boards. I mean, really, interesting stuff. Interesting, too, that the CCRB and the police department disagreed on a lot of things. Right now, the only reason the CCRB can prosecute its own cases, it used to be that the police department would prosecute the CCRB complaints against their own members. And so the police department was the prosecutor, the police department was the judge, and since this MOU was entered into between the CCRB and the police department, the CCRB gets to prosecute its own cases. But that's only by virtue of the fact that the mayor and the police commissioner allow that to continue. And we asked why that shouldn't be put in the charter. And the answer from the police department was basically, we would never go back to the way it used to be, but we should be able to reserve the right to go back to the way it used to be, which I personally think is a completely inadequate answer. So anyway, very interesting. I don't know if you have public safety committee chairs, who are interested in that, but I think that's also a very interesting topic that the commission is seriously looking at. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. We're going to ask Councilmember Kalos if you'd like to give a report.
Sure. Feel weird without being able to tell me to keep it short, but so I want to thank all the... Perfect, well, Aldrin just did, so that is good enough. I want to start by thanking the borough president and all the community boards for...
Time's up.
So quickly on the voice text, you only had about a month to act on it. So thank you. A lot of folks came out to testify. I want to appreciate that. I think we got about a little less than a dozen elected officials on board, And so the goal is to get city planning to get it through. We would love as many changes as possible. Specifically, 25 is too tall, it should be shorter, and 75 is too short, it should be taller. The borough president said 90 feet, I'm with the 200 feet. And anything is in the right direction, then ultimately at the council, we have to negotiate what's in scope and what we can amend on our own. I've amended the city planning text before. We did it with Gail on the Sutton Tower. And so I guess the thing would be that if community boards can stay involved, continue to do it. Once it gets out of city planning, I'm hoping that you will do additional hearings and put pressure on your local elected officials to get it amended in the council, and at the same time, particularly for CBs 1, 5, a little bit of 6, and a little bit of others, start, if you would convene a committee right now to focus on the summer text amendment. I think it works better when you give them a starting point versus when they do it on their own. I wanted to mention that we worked with Councilmember Diana Ayala on the last budget, not this budget, but last year's budget, to secure $75 million for the East River Esplanade. We were joined by Nilsa Arama from CB11. We also, I think, had representation from CB8. We had Diana Ayala's there. We had Matthew Washington here. I do not see him there today, but we had a whole group of folks to announce that, and we're now up to $275 million in investment for our parks, and it's still not enough for it to be better than the West Side. So we're working on it. We are working on it. You've heard me talk about campaign finance before. I checked the minutes last time. Last time I just said a bunch of elected officials had pledged not to take real estate money. Now we have the results. So I have a hypothesis that would limit the amount of big money in the election. In 2013, 75% of the money was big money. This year, it was less than 20, it was 27%. We flipped campaign finance on its head. 60% of the money came from small dollars, and we've actually elected the first citywide elected official without real estate money. And the reason that matters is with all the stuff you're dealing with city planning, BSA, LPC, it helps when they're not taking money from the other side, the people that they have to rule on. So I think that is a huge deal. You can read more about it in Gotham Gazette. I look forward to joining the borough president at tonight's congestion pricing forum. I will be there. If you want a preview of what I'll be talking about, it'll be in the Daily News later today. I have an idea to limit the traffic into the city as a whole and to spare Manhattan some of the concerns that I have and actually offer relief everywhere. Who has a district where you have traffic in your district? I just see a show of hands, because right now they say it's only below 61st Street. So any boards above 61st Street that have traffic. Okay. Everyone has traffic. And last but not least, I just say participatory budgeting is starting in 9 days. Asking for the community boards to help amplify it. There is now digital voting citywide. You can actually host digital voting in your offices. We can work with the community, with elected officials such as myself and others to bring it to your district offices. And ultimately, it would be amazing to activate the budget committees to play a role in participatory budgeting. I know at least in my district, it's hard to get delegates. I would love to work with the community boards in a more official capacity to put things on there. I went too long, thank you.
Thank you. Community board chair updates. I think last time we started with 12, so we will start with 1 this time.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. A couple of recurring items, but on Monday, Tuesday, March 25, we'll receive certification from the city on the borough-based jail system, or the closing of Rikers Island. And CB1 will have 2 land-use hearings, April and May, and the end of May, we will submit our ULURP recommendation. Now, we're holding it off a little bit because we want to hear from CB3. They're going to have their hearings in April. Because even though it is in CB1, most of the people affected are in the Chinatown area. And there's a real overlap between ours and potentially with CB2, which is the effectiveness. So just to let you know, all those will be posted on our website, and we're looking forward to the CB3 on that. Congestion pricing. Our transportation took up the issue, and we'll discuss that next week, we'll vote on it in our full board meeting. And I think that all of us have at least the basic principles of fixing problems. Traffic and the effect on our quality of life, the taking over the streets, and then the funding of public transportation is a critical issue. But we're concerned about how it's being done and whether or not those problems will be fixed. So we'll talk more about that. Interested in hearing on yours. Last week, the mayor invited us to a new version of the Lower Manhattan Coastal Resiliency, which is, and of all of our three sides of CB1 covered by sewer lines, on the west side, Valley Park City Authority is moving ahead with something. There was some money for the battery, the old battery park, but financial district and Seaport have become a problem. And the mayor's office or have really been completely silent with us for 1 year. And they finally came back and said, oh, we can't do that. We're going to have to build outboard. So that, of course, causes a lot of concern and questions, and we'll continue to work with that. It's a major issue. It's positive that steps are being taken, so we laud that, but the devil's always in the details of how this will work. And then finally, a little more day to day, we have a hell of a time with school crossing guards.
Yes.
I don't know what the rest of you are experiencing, but we have them to move or they move on to other jobs. And we have almost all of our schools in Lower Manhattan, kids trying to cross West Street and unprotected. So I have to, the local precincts have been fairly accommodating, and they'll even send over uniformed officers at the school break or going home. But a kid or kids trying to cross West Street or any other major street in Manhattan has become a major problem of retaining crossing guards in our district. I don't know what you're experiencing. Might be a good topic for us all to talk about at some point. But the program itself, system-wide, is just not working. You know, we get a couple of new people, but it doesn't fix the problem. That's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you. CB2? CB2 going once. If no one's going to speak for CB2, we'll let Ben speak again. Okay, CB3.
Yes, hi, good morning. I'm David Ford, the First Light Chair, here on behalf of Alicia Lewis-Coleman and our board. First of all, she wanted to say happy Women's History Month, and certainly she's one of my sheroes. We have a few highlights. The New York City Transit, in regard to the M14 bus, they failed to properly notify our community about their attempt to remove 9 local bus stops. They were actually going to have the bus run its full contingent down 14th Street, and then when they turned onto Avenues A's and C, D, they were going to be skipping stops, at least 9 stops along that route. And as you know, Rosie, many seniors and low-income neighbors will be affected by this plan to put that SBS bus line there. This originally was for the L train shutdown, and now they attempted to just slide this in on the community. Susan Stetzer, our district manager, caught on to it. Council member Carlina Rivera and Assembly member Harvey Epstein will be holding a rally tomorrow, Friday, at 1 p.m. At Village East, which is a Mitchell Lawn development. Also, our land use committee is going to be preparing a resolution for the Manhattan Detention Center in April in collaboration with CB1, so that we have a strong front on the master plan for borough jails, and that's it. Everything else is just the residual issues we deal with daily. Thank you.
Thank you. CB4.
Lowell Kern, First Vice Chair from Burt Lazarine. First of all, on the women's building on West 20th Street that Rosie mentioned, the developer had come in and made certain representations to us and asked for some zoning amendments that we granted. And they've come back to us and said, well, we can't do what we promised we were going to do, so it's too expensive. So we are negotiating with the developer, but as of now, we are at opposite ends of the spectrum from the Borough President's office, and that we are not currently supporting the developer's new plan, since a lot of the original plan had to do with preservation of the prison So the history of the building was preserved, and now they've basically said, yeah, we'll keep a picture of a couple of cells on the wall, and that's it. So we have issues with that developer and are opposed to the proceeding right now. We also are at odds at the moment with the Speaker's office, our council member. There were a couple of sites in Hell's Kitchen that were supposed to be mid-range affordable housing. That grew out of the zoning for Hudson Yards. And about 2 weeks ago, I guess it was, Corey came out and announced that that was going to be very low income and supportive housing. So we're in negotiations with the Speaker's office about what was promised back when he was chair of CB4. Actually, before he was even chair, while he was on the board. So we've got that going on. We also have heard this month presentations from the Hell's Kitchen South Coalition about their proposals in terms of regenerating is the right word, the Hell's Kitchen South neighborhood with open space and housing plan, and they'll be presenting to the full board in April. And I've caused enough trouble already, so I'll stop there.
CB5, CB6.
Wait, I get to speak again.
Yes. And now you're done. Thank you, CB6.
Hi, everybody. I'm going to invite Corinne up in just a moment, our chair of our housing committee. But I just want to mention a few things. The ESCR, Coastal Resiliency, is moving forward. They're presenting the DEIS in April, so the next few weeks. And then we'll go into ULIRB in July, so we'll do CB3 closely on that, and we're coming to all of our meetings and being really open to communication, but it's still, a lot of big issues and a lot of questions. So we had a death in a serious crash in the neighborhood around the East Queens Midtown Tunnel a few weeks ago. Just pedestrian deaths and buses and cars hitting pedestrians. So we're going to walk through with DOT, and I'm all for more enforcement, including more traffic managers, school safety and all, but congestion pricing, some of those things, I'm hoping that helps, because this is all it's just a gridlock in our community. Two things I wanted to ask all the chairs. Are you guys for the Beta NYC thing? You're not for
The scooters?
No, Beta NYC.
The
is
CRMs? The CRM.
Yeah, the CRM program is like tracking your service issues that come into the district offices. And I guess the borough president's office came and asked everyone, it's $10,000 per board, and asked if we would all pitch in and we would have this CRM.
Let me just say, it's not the borough president's office.
Right, I was about to say, we invited.
There's someone here that has come several times to this meeting.
Beta NYC,
right.
And they have office spaces here.
Okay.
And they have done for us a lot of the mapping of the board members and other things for us. So they are proposing this, and this is their pilot. And in order for them to make it work, they would need, I think the number was 30 community boards from the 5 boroughs to chip in 10,000 each. And that's what they would need to get the pilot off the ground.
Right. Well, we would love to have something like that. So that's all. I just wanted to get the consensus if anyone else, we have 10,000 in our, we'd like to pitch in. So if anyone else needs that, I mean, it's tracking when people call in the office. There's, we use a spreadsheet now and some other, systems, but we would really use something like that. I'm surprised that we don't have that. Citywide already. It's shocking that we don't have something that tracks similar to 311, but we can follow up and.
So let's leave that discussion after the community board report, because we did have a presentation and it is important to see where the rest of the boards are on that.
Okay,
so thank you for asking the question. I'll bring it back at the end.
Okay, and I'm going to stop and just invite Corinne up, and working with CB7 on the NYCHA conversions, the RAD and PAC, we have resolutions. And they haven't been passed by our full board, but Corinne Vanderdonk, do you have copies of the resolution?
I have 2 copies.
So
and I emailed CB7's resolution to all the board chairs.
Okay, so it's very similar. And I don't know what other boards are dealing with this.
It was passed in committee. And Roberta
Right,
also.
Roberta also didn't go to full board yet, but we'd like to have everyone consider it. And I don't know, Corinne, is everyone familiar with the RAD conversions, the RAD Act? Yeah, just speak to it maybe just briefly and
yeah, I'll try to keep it brief. So I worked together with Roberta and Madeline from her subcommittee on public housing on this. So there is, as Rosie probably knows, there's a big RFP out right now to convert, I believe, 6,200 units.
No, it's
6,000.
But it's 16, well, they've taken 16 developments in Manhattan and combined them into one RFP, which means that a small, like Guy Riverside, which is an independent nonprofit, was going to bid on Wise Towers. They can't because the requirement is that you need a certain amount of money and a certain amount of.
And it sounds like there's only one developer that can actually.
Well, yeah. So there's
RFP out for one developer.
Yeah. So we have two resolutions. Roberta merged them into one. One is from looking at other RAD conversions, it being resident-centered is incredibly important for it to be successful. And so we are currently, even though it's allowed by the HUD regulations, the NYCHA conversions, the residents are not being centered at all, and they're just going to be told after an RFP has been accepted, who's been accepted, and only then will they be included, which is actually against what is being asked for in the RAD. So we have passed a resolution to have tenant associations or residents, if there is no tenant association, to be part of the RFP process in some way. If not at all possible, we're asking for that the residents can submit a statement of needs so that the contractors can look at that and base their bidding on that, or HUD NYCHA can use that as a tool to see who would be a good bidder. And then on top of that, we want to very strongly support Gail's letter, which, Roberta, you want to speak to that? Or who wants to speak? I think Rosie, you already mentioned it, where again, it looks like there's just basically one giant developer with a really bad reputation when it comes to centering residents, who is going to be able to bid on this bundle. And so the bundle should really be separated so that nonprofit organizations can bid on these RFPs. Again, because it needs to be resident-centered, these leases are going to be 100 years, and this process needs to be, or 99 years to be exact. So this process needs to be done well, and right now it's not looking like it's being done that way. So, Roberta, thank you.
That's all
Okay.
See if any other boards wanted to resolution.
So yeah, I'm working with Roberta on that, yes.
CB7. So we have this resolution passed Tuesday night, 18-0, at steering and will come up before full board.
This resolution that she was just talking about passed at CB7.
Ours is a little different.
Slightly different, and CB6 it hasn't gone to full board, just for clarification.
None of us have gone to full board.
Yeah, but it will, yeah.
And we've been working with Board 9 on this. It just, unfortunately, Board 9 people weren't able to meet with us, but we did pass along the resolutions. We testified last week about the excessive tall buildings, along with Board 8 and Board 5, and Gail was there and Ben was there. So we had two resolutions. It was for the zoning text amendment with about 12 conditions that we wanted changed. We also had a resolution asking for a moratorium until the zoning text amendment is put into place with all of the additions that we asked for. Our urban fellow is working on a map of affordable housing in our district, which we think will be replicable. So once we have it, we will send it around to the other boards. He's using data from the Furman Center, has put it into an interactive platform of some sort. And then with a map of affordable housing. So we're probably going to have him speak at the April Housing Committee meeting. Once it's up on our website, I will send everybody the link. And we're working on tonight on several TV shows on MNN. One is on NYCHA with Victor Bach and the head of our NYCHA task force. The other one is on high school kids from West Side High, which is a transfer school, doing a whole program on the Four Freedoms and Norman Rockwell. And then a third program on our vice chair and her work at the Children's Aid Society.
Is that it? Okay. CBA.
Thanks, hi everyone. Okay, scooters are a big thing for us. So I'm wondering, are there any community boards that are opposed to scooters, this pilot program? I'm thinking, I was talking to Ben about it earlier, that if we could, let me ask you this, are there any community boards who are in favor of the pilot program that the scooter companies are pushing? And one of the reasons we're so opposed is because I personally am so opposed. I've heard nightmare stories from friends in LA where there is very, very little pedestrian foot traffic. I lived out there. There's hardly anybody ever on the streets. And there have been lots of incidents of injuries to pedestrians, the few that there are. They're treacherous. I've seen it in Baltimore where they just lay them across the sidewalk. It violates the ADA Act, because there's no ability to be mobile on the sidewalk, strollers, toddlers, wheelchairs, walkers. It violates the charter and the zoning resolution, which require safety and health issues to be paramount. There are issues about fire safety when people bring them up to be charged because that's how they get paid. They are nightmares, so that's how we see it. We have a resolution from Transportation and from Board opposing the e-scooters. They're bundled together with a lot of the bikes, some of which we're in favor of and some of which I think we're not. Are there any boards that are in favor of the pilot? Do you think we might be able to, if you take them up to have a unified Manhattan idea about this, that maybe, I don't know, I think Gail maybe not have a position on this yet, but maybe all of us together can support it. Sure. Right now it's up in Albany. My understanding is the governor has embedded it into the budget because he wants home rule on it from the communities. The scooters have a very, very powerful lobbying group. Liz Kruger is really fighting hard on this, so if you care about it, to call the state representatives and a senator and assembly people, because it's up in Albany first. So that's one thing for us. I'll send around the resolution. On Fetner, we're trying to get the NYCHA appraisal because apparently the appraisal for this infill project is $60 million. It's public land. The money that Fetner, the developer, is giving is $25 million, which leads to some significant imbalance, which has driven Gal to write a letter opposing it. Has anyone gotten any appraisals from NYCHA about anything? Okay. We passed the borough-wide resolution on the tall buildings from CD7 at committee, and then kind of messed up at the board. There was an incident apparently at Wagner Junior High School in line with the anti-Semitism, racist sentiments that are being expressed throughout the city, where one of the board members related that she had heard that in a sewing or some kind of class involving yarn, that someone had fashioned a kind of noose and put it around somebody's neck and said something about historic, that would be in line with history, or just something very, very offensive. So this is very anecdotal. Wagner took no action. And we this came up at the board meeting last night, so I asked the education committee to work with her and see what's going on. But I wonder if, not that if we could also do maybe a borough-wide thing, just establishing all the community boards, endorsing the anti-hate sentiments. There have been a lot of, over the course since the Proud Boys were up on the Upper East Side, and there was a press conference, a number of press conferences, but just again to have the uniformity, because that is a significant issue, what's been going on all over the city
Just
about
passed a
this.
hate crime resolution based on Mark Levine. Is it Mark Levine's legislation?
It was Mark Levine's, and there was the
Second
two,
semester.
1, 2, 3, 4, and another one, yes.
Oh, other boards.
Good. One of our board members wants to do a forum on hate.
Oh, that would be good,
So
we
maybe
could do
we
it
could do
together,
it, yeah.
yeah, that would be great, because it's a big issue. So, also in the MTS, we're trying to get more air quality monitors. I don't know if it's an issue for any of you near the bridges or the tunnels or anything else. They only have 4, 2 times a year for 2 weeks that are monitoring air quality in the perimeter of the MTS. It's a major issue, it involves your, as well, Nilsa, to try and get more air quality in around the playgrounds and around the schools around there, around senior centers. We also have an issue where we're trying to get more school safety people, because there are schools right there with these garbage trucks barreling by, and have been told that it's very, very difficult to get crossing monitors. Landmarks, I'm trying to get a consortium, it was suggested at the board meeting last night, of people who have a particular interest in landmarks to go down to the LPC and ask them to send all potential designations to the boards, which they're supposed to do, but which they seem to be forgetting to do. So if anyone wants to join me on that, it would be a nice thing to be able to do. And finally, in the charter thing, we are asking to have communities involved in the RFP process, because that one sounds horrible. We had one with the Queensboro Oval where it's now a tennis bubble, where the word tennis was used 12 times in the RFP. So clearly the city had a thing, and other RFPs, the one for Fetner, where they had do not pay attention to the zoning resolution on the sky exposure plane in the RFP. So this stuff is greatly concerning. So that's one of our things about the charter. And also with Fetner, the community was utterly shut out of any kind of process, even though Fetner said he met 20 times with the community on average. When we had a 5-hour hearing, and the first 3 hours of it were people from Holmes and Isaacs NYCHA coming to our meeting and expressing their concerns about the project. So they had no opportunity to be heard. So in terms of the RAD and that developer, I am totally in line where the communities are not being heard on this. So thanks for all your patience, and I'm done.
Thank you. CB9.
Hi, good morning everyone. Briefly, just wanted to update everyone. I mentioned that we were going to be having a conference with a few other partners, West Harlem Development Corporation, and some other organizations that provide support to the formerly incarcerated. And that was occurred on February 28th at Columbia University. It was very successful. The board also passed a unanimous resolution supporting the participation of Board 9 as a member part of the Manhattan Collaborative for Justice. So that is something that we are working on together for all different partners, and it's moving forward very well. We also are in the process of back and forth with DOT. They've been coming by on many occasions to make a change to Amsterdam Avenue between basically 116 to 155th, some parts to reduce the lane. Again, as part of what is a traffic calming. There is obviously going to be an aspect of congestion that happens from that. And something that we're looking at is potential pollution in that area, and the effect on asthma. As we know, there's a high rate of asthma in Harlem, so we are having back and forth with them. We have tentatively support, have a lot of absolutely coming up today for voting in terms of support, but we do have some conditions that we would like them to meet before they move forward. We've been having a few discussions with some of our elected officials around the Marijuana Legalization Act. Obviously we feel that there is a certain amount of social justice that needs to happen together with that act. It has impacted our community negatively for quite some time. And so we are hoping that our elected officials are able to address some of those concerns prior to this signing. We've had different discussions with some of these elected officials. We are, we're looking to potentially have a town hall, speaking to the community board 10, just to raise concerns and let the governor know that while there is support for this, there are a few things that we want to make sure are not necessarily pushing through and make it happen without having these conditions addressed. So this is definitely something that we're bringing up. Recently, we supported our Senator Brian Benjamin's bill, which was to ensure that liquor establishments, not just restaurants and bars, come to the boards, because the wine stores or liquor stores can open up without necessarily coming to the board. So now he's putting a bill that should be coming, and we supported that, and so we're hoping to see a little bit more around that. And finally, there's a decent amount of bills that's currently addressing rent regulation in Albany. We have had, it came out of committee initially, it's going to be coming up for full general board today for voting. That's why I will be able to attend the congestion pricing discussion. I really wanted to be there. But those bills are addressing, ensuring that folks in our communities, that rent regulation is there on their behalf. So we support many of the bills in there. We ask that you do take a look at them. I would be happy to pass some of the resolutions so you can take a look at some of the different specific bills that we are supporting in the Thank you all.
Thank you.
We've run out, so
Thank you.
Sorry.
Okay, CB10.
Hi, my name is Deborah Yates. I'm here for our chair, Cicely Harris. She wanted me to mention a few things. We hosted a Black Women's Summit on Monday entitled From Income Disparity to Economic Equity that was very successful from 6 to 9 at the National Black Theater. We are reinstating the Re-Entry Committee on Public Safety, and we have a job for community assistant available. In addition, our housing committee continues to look at opportunity zones and how it will be affected in our area. And to CB9's point of rent regulations, they continue to look at the preferential rent issue. The education department is now looking at putting together a resolution. Education committee is looking to put together a resolution in regards to specialized high schools in light of the recent report on the people that were admitted and not admitted. Also, we've recently been having an issue on 135th Street. There are quite a few schools in the area that are all released at the same period of time, and we've had some gatherings of lots of kids, and so we're working with the 32nd Precinct to see how best to handle that, because I actually am the chair of the Education Congress Committee, and for me it's a fine line, because we have to deal with, of course, we want people to be safe, and we understand that social media is a large part of that, but also we have to understand that these are kids. These are urban kids. The sidewalks are their playgrounds, the subways, they get a little rowdy, but we have to make sure that we don't create some kind of police state, that we don't give the 32nd Precinct license to treat our kids any kind of way, so we're watching the language that we use around this discussion. And so that's a big issue right now. And to his point about legislation around marijuana, we're also looking at trying to have discussions with the youth in our community so that we can discuss with them what that means and what it doesn't mean.
Thank you. CB11.
Good morning, all. So to start, CB11 has had 2 New York State budget forums held in East Harlem within 2 weeks' time. One was done by the senators, Liz Kruger and others, and then the last one was held by New York State Assemblyman Robert Rodriguez to get input from the community regarding the New York State budget. I did not attend the Assemblyman one because I was at work, but the one held by Liz Kruger was standing room only at NYCHA, and a lot of people communicated their fears regarding cuts to programs, and especially senior programs for the disabled, and so there was a very good turnout there. CB11 at their meeting on Tuesday heard the resolution from Community Board 7 and actually did its own resolution based on what CB, we took out some language that because we weren't able to confirm some of the journals that were there, so we just did a general one to support good faith bargaining between Mount Sinai and the New York State Nurses Association. In terms of, we as well supported Brian Benjamin's bill regarding the liquor licenses and having everything disclosed, both on-site and off-site liquor licenses. Children's Aid will be having forums next week because Children's Aid sold their corn a lot. I know we've talked about it here before, and they were going to redevelop their own building. Now it appears that they may consider selling the rest of the property and actually potentially merge their fortunes with the development that will be there. The developer right now is thinking of, with Mount Sinai, creating a building that will house many of their clinics and would potentially give 1 or 2 floors to Children's Aid for their services. That would be different than what they're saying is that if they don't get Children's Aid's property, that then they may consider doing luxury housing. So that is a discussion for next week. In May, the community HPD, HRA is going to have forums on the 2 lots that are up for public redevelopment due to the East Harlem rezoning, which is the East Harlem Multi-Service Center and the NYPD lot. Questions, they've already met with occupants at the East Harlem Multi-Service Center, and the question that has come up is why does it have to be an either-or proposition? Either affordable housing or either not-for-profits, and why there can't be a merge of the 2. If it is only affordable housing, then 13 not-for-profits will be displaced out of the East Harlem community. I was fortunate to attend the El Teatro El Museo del Barrio had their El Teatro ribbon cutting. They had, for 9 months, they had renovations, and Gail was there as part of the ribbon cutting. And so they've really restored some aspects of the theater. They've added more. And so right after there was a concert that was enjoyed by all, except me, that I couldn't stay. The Beyond Sims statue, Pat Moore left, but during this time we also had a forum, a community forum at the Schomburg Center, and it was an opportunity for the community to weigh in and narrow down the artists that had submitted their names and some pictures and renderings of their artwork to try to find, I think it was a list of 10 that will be invited in to give their ideas in terms of something for that space from the replacement of the J. Marion Sims statue. The CB11 Youth and Education Committee, along with others, are going to have this Saturday a film screening called This Ain't Normal. It's going to be a combination of a film screening and a community discussion on youth violence in East Harlem at the Silverman School from 2 to 5:30. This is especially appropriate as within the last week I've gotten notifications of shootings in East Harlem, and so it is appropriate that we start having that discussion and continue that discussion now. As Ben alluded to, we had an event regarding the East Harlem Esplanade, the FDR Esplanade. So money was given to East Harlem. Some of the areas will be shored up, but it is vital that Pier 107 get money. Because if it doesn't, it will fall into the ocean. You know what I mean. Odyssey House is proposing to, on Randall's Island, to expand an opioid treatment center. I'm meeting with them next week to discuss what it is that they have in mind. I will tell you that the community, when it was mentioned at the full board and those in attendance, are upset that, you know, fair share, like we always discuss. And so we're gonna have a small discussion first and then open it up as we need to get an assessment of exactly what they're thinking about and whether the community will be on board with that. I have more, but I'm not gonna keep saying it, so.
Listen, could you send around that liquor store resolution, and I'll send it to the street? Yeah.
Okay, CB12.
CB12 has a lot of activities going on. I'll just be very brief with a few of them. DHS has planned a 175 unit, I should say unit, 475 individuals, men's homeless shelter, 286 Audubon Avenue. Community wants its fair share of that. We already have a men's shelter of 200 beds, women's shelter, as well as a lot of other shelters for men and women. And so we will be holding a public hearing on April 11th. We've had preliminary hearings with the support group and DHS. There will be more discussions going on regarding that itself. We need to know, since it is a former parking garage, whether there has been a cleanup in that area, which they did not tell us at all, and a few other questions in terms of the exact floor plan, which they still did not present us with, and their schedules also during the summer. So we have a lot of work to do, and we will be inviting them with a few talking points to give us that information. We've finished the second of our street co-naming for 2 board members, 2 officers who died in January, 2 weeks apart in January 2018. OBB, First Vice Chair, and Pamela Blackie-North. Gail was there at both of them, and this Saturday was the last at 160 West 169th Street with the usual party activity and food activity later on that Dana Huckleberry usually does for almost all the electives in the city. So it was well attended. I think over 100 people were there, and we gave the family a memorial plaque because we had passed a resolution on that. We are fighting the Amtrak billboard along with Community Board 9 that they suddenly, without announce, put it in a scenic spot on 155th Street and Riverside Drive. That is an issue of federal jurisdiction as well as other areas, and we will see how far we get with that. So Mark Levine is leading that fight along with Congressman Adriano Espaillat. I had the pleasure of attending the Data Week to go to CCNY to see young entrepreneurs who were involved in data. You'd be surprised how many people are involved. And it was a successful program with Zahn Technologies and a few other people who hosted that. We will have 2 of them at our general meeting on Tuesday giving me a presentation. So I was very happy to see that involvement and that enrichment within our community and within the adjoining community as well. That is about it, except 2 other items. We had a forum on preferential rents, which I could give an overview on, which was well turned out. And that's in preparation of our rent guide, our rent resolutions that we will be doing in April in terms of resolutions. Of course, there is now a May 15th deadline, I think, for legislation in Albany, which will also be red reform groups will be taking buses and whatnot to give their opinions. As for Brian Benjamin's bill, I think it passed 2 days ago for off-premises licenses and getting community involvement in that as well. So we're sort of happy about that. And I believe that's enough, and thank you.
Rosie, can I add one thing? Because there's so much construction. The DOB came to our zoning committee meeting last month, and they said that they grant after-hours variances and they don't, based on the developer's representations, and they don't pull them unless there are objections by the public, which I think was really surprising, that their first instinct is to support it. And we had, so I thought that's all that you should know, is that we're trying to get, also as part of the charter thing, or just in relation to the DOB, advanced notification of all after-hours construction variances, because we've had big issues with one developer where they started at 4 in the morning and there were 120 cement trucks that were there, lined up at 4 in the morning on a Saturday. And that was after they stayed till 9 the night before. Ben gratefully called the DOB, I understand. And so now the developer had to come to the community board. It took 2 hours at a housing committee hearing to get them to reveal that they were seeking variances. They had to come back to us, that they were seeking variances for 52 consecutive Saturdays. They started out by saying they were looking for 3 months, then 4 months, and then finally they blurted out that it was 52 variances. And we said, what? So you have to be really careful.
So DOB doesn't even give you notice when there's a stop work order on a project that is major and could be hazardous. So there is that lack of communication.
Yeah, they've been giving variances to the building that is permitted to be built.
Well, there you go.
Rosie had the bill on AHVs in the council. What would it do if we could get it passed?
Well, there was a lot of changes done to the bill. I'm talking to the borough president about it. It would create some kind of notification. The bill as originally written was overbroad, so it didn't take into consideration institutions like hospitals, the Port Authority, places where you can't really do work during the day, so you have to do it at night and you need an after-hour variance. So that went from being a half-page or page legislation to be like 3 or 4 pages, because it created exceptions to policies in certain cases. It's a bill that Dan Garotnik and I worked on. I think that bill, after we made the changes, was a really good bill. It gives some flexibility to developers, particularly in these situations where they can't do the work during the day. It gives more flexibility to developers that are building where there's nothing else near there. And it puts some restraints when they're building in a very predominantly residential area. So I think it would be a good thing to.
Is there transparency and communication in that bill, or like that's what we need, like flexibility, but we need to know what's going on. I mean, they need to.
Yes, it acts actually, because right now the DOB can give an after-hours variance when a developer claims they have an emergency situation. You never have to specify what the emergency situation is. You just claim it and say it, and it is so, almost like God. And so this acts for clarification. What is that emergency situation? So that it could be determined whether they're just really trying to advance to work and get it done quickly, or whether there really is some kind of emergency situation that exists. It creates a part for a public hearing if there's continuous complaints and many after-hours variances that were issued. So
it also turned out when that developer came that their so-called emergency was really about improving their profits. So it was their own personal need.
Behind schedule and over budget is not an emergency.
Right.
Rosie's bill gets to be reintroduced. We are trying to reintroduce
You have
it.
our support.
Yes.
So it should hopefully be reintroduced soon. We're trying to push the sponsors on it, and
so you should speak to the borough president. She's also trying to reintroduce it. She was, when she was in the council, it was me, her, and Dan who introduced it.
Yeah.
And then she was borough president, and Dan and I have made a lot of changes to it. So.
We have a boiler, as Rosa mentioned, there's 5 ways they can get the after-hours variance. We have a boilerplate letter we usually send to DOB, but basically, if it's internal, they can do it. If it's for school or public works, but most of the time, they either have to have a financial hardship, which isn't we're gonna lose money, but that actually like the building will go under, and then like a public safety emergency, which is something that is currently the subject of the 58 Sutton litigation. And so the other piece is, just so you know, 2 years ago we passed a new noise ordinance. So the decibel level is going from 85 to 75. Also, we changed the definition for sensitive receptors, so they don't have to go into somebody's house anymore. If you're having any, and this is in residential neighborhoods, so with DEP, if you're getting in a situation where DEP is not being responsive, as part of our law that we wrote, they're supposed to be more responsive. So if you're having any trouble whatsoever with the noise variances, and it also gives DEP the power to show up on a construction site and shut it down, which is not a power they had before.
For internal, could you just be careful? They claimed that having heaters would be internal, and again, pulling teeth, they finally revealed that it would be noisy from the heaters and the trucks to do this. So even though they said it was internal, there are external components, so just in definitions.
In our boilerplate, it says the fact that we got a 301 complaint indicates that it was not de minimis noise. So generally, the after hours would mean they were doing painting indoors. not jackhammering or demo or things like that. So usually we use the 301 complaint to get rid of that will have minimal noise impact. And the other piece is the noise mitigation plans for after hours variances now have to be online. So we can pull all those.
There was a
Noel from Beta NYC, who has some of this mapped and tracked.
We did a few things last year. The one thing is that we got Gail to send a letter to DOB asking for the after-hour variances to be posted to the city's open data portal in compliance with the open data law in a disaggregated format. DOB has not responded to that, and Gail's office has followed up in regards to that letter, and still no response from DOB. And this is part of DOB's system that they're in the process of converting from the old DOB to DOB Now 2.0, and they're saying that they need more time, or at least initially through our back-channel communications, so that they need more time for after-hours variances. The second thing that we've started to look at, and we have some prototypes, I think in CB1 or maybe in one of the other boards in Lower Manhattan, is that DOB doesn't even do any type of data validation when it comes down to, does a after-hours variance, when they fill out all of their form, and there's certain things like, are they within a certain proximity to after, or like a residential, they don't, like, there's no way to validate, DOB doesn't validate that information, which leads to developers then saying that no, they're not close to a residential facility, when in reality they are close to a residential facility, and DOB then, as you said, just automatically approves the after-hours variances. So there's other opportunities for improvement within that, and just wanted to make sure that you all were aware of the work that has been done so far.
Yeah, there needs to be a change in attitude that really, that government works for the public as opposed to the private developers. That's just my opinion.
Let me just ask if there's any representative from a council member's office to give a report, because I think they all left. Okay, he works for Ben Kalo, so we could have more discussion. All Ben, all the time. So the CB6 raised a question wanting to know which community boards were considering the CRM and had the $10,000 to be part of this pilot program. So I want to bring that up for discussion now before we close this meeting. Yes?
We met with them with CB5, and CB5 had offered half the amount. And CB7 is thinking about it. We just had a couple of questions that, but we think it's a good program. We just had a couple of, few little questions.
Any other boards?
We had a presentation on Thursday prior from Beta NYC. They came, they showed us a website that they had. They spoke about the spreadsheets that they were doing, and they had mentioned the $10,000 investment. And so that's something that the executive committee talked about but hasn't reached a decision on.
We've been very supportive of it. I don't know if we've wrestled with the $10,000 note yet. I'm not going to sleep with it. But we're very supportive of the whole project.
Okay, anyone else?
I think we're hoping to work with Gail to just figure out funding mechanisms. Had some preliminary elected officials have expense funding and capital funding. PB is only capital. We're trying to figure out if we can use capital to pay for software. So I think myself, the borough president, Councilmember Fernando Cabrera, we're trying to see if we can just chip in, because $10,000 for 30 community boards might be tough, but $300,000 for an elected official is a little easier. So we're looking at that. I think one thing I'm curious about is the public advocate uses some client relationship management called City CRM, so does the Senate. One of the questions, maybe we can bring Senate here to do a demo of their CRM, or better to just stick with doing the fact-finding stuff?
So, a few things.
Yeah.
I helped put together the platform
Yeah,
at
so you built
a
it,
decade
yeah.
ago, and happy to reconnect with the Senate team that has been working for the last 10 years on that tool. They are revamping its user interface, and we're getting a demo on Monday. So at least the good news is that internally the CRM team is going to start evaluating the Senate tool in an expedited fashion. It may not be in the position to roll out in regards to the fiscal constraints of this fiscal year. So we're actively exploring the CRM at the Senate and the tool that they have and all of the improvements that have been done in the 10 years. Yesterday I got a demo of a tool that the Bronx, some Bronx community boards are also putting in place, which is, it's not open source, but it is a tool that seems to meet their immediate needs, which is kind of like a gap, and we're trying to figure out exactly how to work with that provider. It may be an interim solution to get us to another further tool.
Can the data be exported?
The data would be able to be exported. The third thing that we are actively working on is at least be in the position to have all community boards who want a stopgap solution for the next fiscal year is to sign on for this $10,000. We have through Brooklyn boards, and the committed Brooklyn boards have enough kind of like pooled resources to start the project, which means that there will be a platform that Manhattan boards can essentially adopt to buy into, which will provide a facilitated gap for one fiscal year. So then hopefully we're in a position with Councilmember Kalos, Councilmember Cabrera, and the Manhattan Borough President, and also hopefully the Brooklyn Borough President, to provide a solution that's paid for outside of community board funds. So this is kind of the strategy of where we're at. We are looking for boards to sign on to this particular contract at where they can give. This is that NPR model. Please contribute what you can. We'll provide you that service for one fiscal year plus the 3 months of this fiscal year.
So our big concern is that on two levels. One is, 5 boards buy in, but the other 7 next year get it free, or do they have to buy in? We have this pool of money right now that we may never see again. June 31st is fast approaching. And so we don't know, that's a major concern of ours. And we'd like to, and we understand that this is for phase 1, and that phase 2 and phase 3 are coming. And what if we have no money and no resources? So we think it'd be good if the council and the borough presidents could.
Audrey.
Yeah, no, those are, we too have concerns like that. This is like a bridge, right? It's not like we're trying to fill a gap that exists. So many boards might feel, am I a guinea pig in this, or am I a pioneer? Or both. So I think that at least from our office's perspective, we see this as a way where it's a proof of concept and it's built, informed by community boards, so that ultimately, like, none of this should really be maintained or done or paid by community boards. It should really be done through the do it. It should really be something you really do to do it. And part of all 59 community boards in the city of New York, you know, through allocated budget, have this kind of technology, civic technology infrastructure paid for, supported, maintained. Unfortunately, to get to that plateau, we have to do a lot of heavy lifting. And the heavy lifting is not going to be like equally shared sacrifice. It's really the early adopters, people who get this. And then I guess the challenge for Beta NYC and our office, who really has a strategic partnership with Beta NYC, is how do we make sure that's equitable for those community boards that were the early adopters, early chipped in, so that in the event that they don't have money in year 2, year 3 for the maintenance and the sustainability of this, that you don't get, you know, left out in the cold over that, and that other folks are not necessarily free riders in a sense of kind of developing this technology. It's not an easy question. It's not an easy question, especially since we don't really necessarily, we think we have a sense of what the end of the tunnel might look like in terms of a citywide adaptation, supported, financed by the city, done by Do It. But, you know, we can't really, you know, say that that would be the case. I don't know if that helps. I mean, you know.
I mean, in this 1 year, what we're, in the statement of work that we've sent out, is that we'll provide trainings, not only on, this money will not only provide a platform for us to send resources to your offices to engage in the construction of a tool. You will have the tool within 3 months to start working with, right? And then that gives us a year of support for that particular tool, as well as different types of trainings that we can provide. The contract itself is written in a way that it's very open, where we can then, we will have enough resources that we can go out to different community board offices, and we're looking at the numbers, and if we have the right perspective, we can actually send trainers and do in-board or in-community trainings of open data as well as this particular tool. So, you know, there's a broader set of resources that you're getting, not just a stopgap solution. We will have access to our tech team as well as access to our trainers, so that way you can get open data training classes as well as trainings on how to maintain the tool, and the resources to kind of like think about the future while we advocate for something that you don't have to pay for.
So Noah, that's for phase 1, what you're describing, but then phase 2 is like a monthly kind of charge that range from 50 to.
Yeah, phase 1 is 3 months of this fiscal year, 12 months of the next fiscal year. And in those 15 months, we hope that phase 2 and phase 3 are ultimately picked up by the city.
So Councilman Ben Kalos left, but Wilfredo, maybe you can tell us. I know, I don't think you're the budget person, but every year, sometimes the budget priorities, initiatives, they all change. He indicated that they were trying to get software to be considered capital. Do we have an idea when that might happen, if it happens?
I was speaking with Sushant and Councilmember a lot of capital needs that we're shooting for, so we're still trying to get information in terms of, you know, not only the cost, but also when the implementation is going to happen. I can follow up and get you maybe more detail.
When's the deadline for expense at the City Council?
I believe, don't quote me on this, I believe it's next week, end of next week.
End of next week.
Yeah.
And Manhattan delegation?
I think it's like a few days before.
Okay.
I need clarification there.
So, when I was a council member, I would get requests from the community board sometimes for capital, for computers, and that at one point was just expense, and it got changed in the city system to be capital eligible. So don't know when this is going to happen. That would be a good thing. There are minimums of $35,000 though, in order for it to be capital eligible. So I don't know if it's a council member grouping several community boards, whether you can meet that threshold, whether it can be done through the Manhattan delegation. But right now, it's not designated so. So if, you know, you might want to have conversations with your council members to see if they might consider some expense funding, so to bridge the gap, or to have some money to put in for the Manhattan boards toward that 10,000 mark. And the deadline's around the corner, and then there's Manhattan delegation where all the council members collectively usually need like 3 or 4 council members to be in agreement to fund a certain project. So just for things for you to think about in case you haven't thought about that yet. Because I know looking at your own budget and whatever your expenses could be, it could be daunting, it could be impossible. And if you've been very frugal and tightening your budget, you may have that money left over now to do it. So, okay. So, do I hear a motion to adjourn the meeting?
Second.
Everyone in favor?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you.
Nope.